Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we love with the best broadcasters, bloggers, and writers in the industry on a daily basis, and of course, analysis from myself. So for those of you who watch me on a regular basis, I at times make the comment that we are here for the smart fan, the hardcore fan, but in a sense, we take it to another level today. We got Josh on the line from College Football Nerds. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with their platform, to jump on YouTube. Certainly after we take in the conversation here, look up College Football Nerds. It's a smart show on college football metrics, the breakdown of all the major matchups week to week in college football. Josh, we appreciate you stopping by. How you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you've got a good thing going there at College Football Nerds. I've enjoyed the breakdowns and the numbers as well. I'm a bit of a nerd myself, but maybe not a smart nerd. So I rely on guys like you to break it down. So I've got a better perspective on what the numbers mean. So there's numbers, and then there's meaningful numbers, and then there's ways to understand the context of the numbers. And that's what we rely on guys like you for. So looking at the college football season as we stand right now, I have said, even though it's the best product in sports on the field, we've run into this cycle for the past 4 or 5 years. You would ask most college football fans who's dominated the sport. They would answer, obviously, Alabama and Clemson. If you take it, stretch it out to another level, basically, Alabama and Georgia are in the SEC. Clemson's in the ACC. Ohio State's dominated the Big Ten, and Oklahoma, the Big 12. And they have comprised the contenders of the college football playoff almost since its inception, certainly since 2015 and 16. So has this dynamic become a little bit boring to you and to College Football Nation, do you think?
It doesn't necessarily bore me. I definitely think it's bored Football Nation, and I think that's pretty obvious to a large extent. I think when you're trying to break down teams, a lot of what we try to do is focus on what makes teams good, and then we nitpick teams on our channel looking at teams that are playoff contenders. And sometimes we come across as maybe a little negative to a lot of people because they're not used to it. It's difficult right now in college football because there's so much isolation, and it's difficult in college football because the same teams keep winning, and they keep winning in a dominant fashion. To be realistic with where you're at and to understand that you can be someone like Clemson in the ACC and you can go undefeated in conference and undefeated through the regular season, and us not really know if you're going to even win your semifinal. Now, I'm not saying I don't believe in Clemson this year. In fact, I think Clemson's played really well the first few weeks of the year. But for example, the start of the season, Clemson, obviously have the close game in North Carolina, but we were pretty critical of the fact that Clemson couldn't get big leads on teams in the first half. Even games like Syracuse were relatively close going into halftime. That stuff is way more important than it used to be in college football, I think, because of all this isolation we have and due to the quality isolation in the sport. And I think the thing that I would say is more than just being boring, I think the thing that's hard for a lot of people is it tends to lean toward a lot of overcriticality. We have to be a lot more negative than we should be because I can't really take any positive from you beating Syracuse. I can only take a negative. And it makes it boring to a certain extent because we never get the interesting twist throughout the season to find out, maybe this team's not for real, or maybe this team's not for real. This team's a lot better than we realized. They just played a tough schedule. It feels like we never find that out until the bowls, and the whole regular season is just this waiting period where we're just like nitpicking all the little things to figure out who belongs.
Got Josh on the line from College Football Nerds to help us break down the playoff race as we stand right now. Obviously, just 2 weeks left in the regular season before championship weekend, the first weekend in December. So as we struggle with the dynamic of, does the SEC get in two teams? If LSU loses to Georgia in the SEC championship game, how do we differentiate between a one-loss Big 12 champion and a one-loss Pac-12 champion? Does Ohio State possibly play into that SEC narrative if they stumble against Penn State or Michigan and still make it in because of how dominant they've been? Does a Minnesota or Baylor, if they can win all the way through, deserve the same type of recognition as the other conference champions? And what do we do with Clemson if they should stumble but still win the ACC? Do you see, are you on the chaos side in regards to rooting for chaos? Or if you're in my camp, you certainly see a situation in which even when most of the public thinks, oh, it worked itself out, I can always point to 2 or 3 resumes and say, those are just as good as the 3 and 4 teams in the playoffs. What is your thought on all these various dynamics and the chaos versus, hey, it works itself out argument?
I think it depends a little bit on what you feel like is deserving, right? When you talk about chaos and it working itself out, it's usually because some team loses, and then we say, okay, well, that sort of self-selects. LSU Alabama was a game that we felt like would work itself out. Georgia LSU is another one. I don't think it's universal that's going to necessarily sort it out, right? There's a real chance Georgia could beat LSU, and that just makes things worse. So sometimes things get more complicated as a result. And the other thing, our channel tries to be very honest with what we feel like is happening in college football. A lot of times, I think in recent years, people have seen us as pro SEC. I swear we're not. Even though we started doing a lot of SEC content, we talk positively about the SEC because, team number 1 through team number 8, they're better than everybody else's 1 through 8. Maybe 1 through 3 in another conference might beat 1 through 3 in the SEC, but particularly 4 through 8, there's really no contest. And the problem is, things work themselves out relative to internally in one conference. And, I don't want to give too much of a long monologue, but can I turn to a stat to sort of compare conferences for you real quick that I think is interesting?
Absolutely.
So, and this is something we just put out on Twitter. So our Twitter is at CFB Nerds. We just did a quick compilation of top 50 SP Plus out of conference wins. Now, there's a lot of advanced metrics. They all have positives and negatives. I think SP Plus is a pretty solid one. Importantly, though, they rank from 1 to 130. And that's something you got to have to do a good job in trying to compare teams. But something we point out a lot is only teams really in the top 50 are meaningful in terms of quality. If you're all your big upsets, your Iowas and your Purdue's, those are still teams ranked like 37th or 45th in SP Plus. They're still top 50 teams. It's just that parity's not that significant in college football, and you're outside top 50 doesn't really matter. So that's where you set the benchmark on whether you're really good. The Pac-12 has 2 out of conference top 50 wins. It's Michigan State, who's 40th in SP Plus, and Texas Tech, who's 47th. That's it. The Big 12 has none. They have not beaten a single top 50 team out of conference. The Big 10 has 3. Notre Dame's 19th, Iowa State's 22nd, and Cincinnati's 29th. And the ACC has 3. That's South Carolina, 41st, Texas A&M, who's actually 17th in SP Plus, and Central Florida, who's 18th. Now, the SEC has 6. That's Notre Dame, who's 19th, Miami, who's 25th, Texas, who's 28th, Oregon, who's 15th, Tulane, who's 36th, and Louisiana Lafayette, who's quietly number 37. Notre Dame, I'll say, actually has 4. They always have more because they play everything's out of conference, but 4 wins. So the point from that metric, when you talk about chaos, when you talk about differentiating conferences, the chaos is caused by the conference beating itself. And you got to be really careful there, because every conference, we say this all the time, every conference is going to go 500 against itself every year. That's a mathematical certainty. So the fact that a conference beats itself up does not mean they're good or bad. It means there's parity in the conference or there's not parity. And a conference that's really, really bad and has one good team is probably going to have an 11-1 or 12-0 team. And a conference that's really awesome and has a bunch of really good teams is probably not. I mean, they're going to have a bunch of guys with 9 or 10 wins, and teams are going to struggle to go undefeated because they're all going to have hard schedules. And I think that's the difficulty. Now, when you talk about all these top 50 wins, 2 of those, like the Big 10, Cincinnati is a benchmark win. Notre Dame beating Michigan, Iowa State. That was that Iowa State-Iowa game, which Iowa State probably should have won, muff a punt at the end of the game. I think there's reason to believe like Ohio State's good. I think there's reason to believe LSU and Alabama is good because there is a mix of out-of-conference wins that are significant there. The Big 12 is very hard because they've got nothing to show for it. So it's all kind of assuming that the Big 12 beating itself is meaningful. And the Pac-12 is just as bad. Arizona State beating Michigan State in a nasty game where Michigan State can't make a field goal, and now that's their best out-of-conference win. And we're going to maybe slot one of those Pac-12 champions, possibly with a loss to Auburn, in the playoff. It's tough. So even when we talk about chaos and slotting it all, you've got to realize how isolated these conferences are. And all that working itself out is really just hoping that conferences don't produce a bunch of teams with 0 or 1 losses.
There's often a theory when you're trying to instruct someone that maybe when you bring in a different voice, it's the same message, but it gets the point across. Bless you, Josh. Thank you so much. These are just bullet point by bullet point what I go through all the time in regards to arguments with my audience, and at times because I've made the point many times that we play a sport in college football in which we have to evaluate the team. So it's unlike any other sport, college basketball to a certain extent, but obviously all the professional sports have an objective system that determines who makes the playoffs. We have to go on an evaluation, and we actually have a schedule that's built not in a way to help serve that process. Most teams play once we hit the last week of September, first week of October. We play in silos in all the conferences. There we have to make a judgment, an eyeball judgment, because as you pointed out, every conference goes 500 against itself. So what does that particular game tell us when one of the top level teams in the conference beats one of the mid-tier teams in the conference, or vice versa, of an 8-5 type team in the Big 12 jumps up and beats Oklahoma? What does that mean? Does that point to the strength of the conference and the depth of the conference, or that its elite team really isn't that good? We don't know necessarily. We have to make a judgment. But most of these teams are scheduling 4 non-conference games, the Big 12 or the Big 12 in the Pac-12 and the Big 10, of course, 3. And typically they're only scheduling one opponent. And the out-of-conference schedule is getting better, but they're typically only scheduling one opponent where we can place any kind of value on that particular game.
Yeah, and you bring that up too, but I think our channel has taken some heat going back and forth because we're not sold that the 9-game conference slate is a good thing. And the reason for that is a lot of the conferences and teams that have gone to a 9-game conference schedule have started dropping significant P5 games. Their philosophy is, if the SEC plays 8 in conference and they play 1 meaningful P5, why should we play 10 meaningful P5? We'll just do 9. From a playoff positioning standpoint, it works. From an evaluator standpoint, it's a nightmare. Because when you look at that whole set of Wisconsin, Iowa, Penn State, that Minnesota, I think it's 2 or 3 P5 games they've played combined. It's like a 6-team set that's all played each other. Wisconsin didn't play one. Again, Iowa over Iowa State is really the most meaningful one in that set. Penn State has a 7-point win over Pitt, and we kind of gloss over that sometimes and say, "Oh, well, they played better later." It's like, well, did they play better later because they started playing better, or did they play better later just because that's what the Big Ten is? I don't think that's what the Big Ten is, but it's such an assumption because there's only a handful of games. And when you've got like 5 ranked teams and you've got 3 out-of-conference data points, that's a lot of isolation. And it means our eye test becomes the dominant thing, which I think you were with me on this. As guys that like to be more analytical, it drives me nuts because that's not what I want to be hanging my hat on, but I have to.
That's why from the beginning of the season, it's funny, Josh. So I unveil a top 25 starting with the very first results of the season, so following the week 1 games. And I clearly explained that I am evaluating these teams strictly on the results on the field. So, for example, in week 1, and there are a lot of assumptions that still need to be made because you've only got 1 game under your belt, 2 games, 3 games. And then as the season unfolds, obviously you have more data points and more results to evaluate these teams. But in week 1, I may choose to slot Maryland as the 12th best team in the country. And I clearly state they're not the 12th best team in the country, but let's say they just beat Texas, who we have to make certain assumptions about how good they are. And I'll rank, let's say, Maryland in the top 10 after week 1. And I will clearly state, I don't personally believe that Maryland is one of the 10 best teams in the country, but they have just beaten a Texas team that gave us this performance last year. And based on personnel gains and losses, we expect to be this good. Therefore, I'm going to rank Maryland here. And when they lose, as we all expect, they will drop in the rankings or drop completely out of the rankings. But everyone just tears me apart because I'm trying to be objective based on just the results on the field and not some kind of, preconception of how good these teams are. Let me throw you a non-conference scheduling model, and then I would love to know if you've thought about that aspect of this, because obviously in evaluating the teams, the scheduling has a ton to do with it. And in terms of in-conference scheduling, it hit me in the head I'd say about 6 or 8 years ago. And this is when LSU and Alabama were clearly the two best teams in the SEC. This was, 2011 range. And one particular year, obviously, everyone plays the same schedule within the division. So if you take Alabama and LSU, they play the other 5 teams in the division. That's the same schedule. So it is critical as to who they play in the other division to separate and be competitive in the race for the division championship. And in this particular year, Alabama played 2 teams that went 1-7 the previous season in the SEC. They played Tennessee and Kentucky. So they played a 2-14 composite teams in the other division. LSU played Georgia and Florida, who went a composite 14-2 the previous season in the SEC. So you have 2 teams competing for division championship who play 2-14 versus 14-2 in the only 2 different teams that they play out of an 8-game conference schedule. So that to me is a huge issue, number one. Number two is the whole non-conference schedule, in which, not thinking about it completely analytically to the metrics side, but my partial solution is, if you play, whether it be 3 or 4 non-conference games, let's say we govern it to a 9-game conference schedule. Well, let's just say we do that. Everybody's got to play a 9-game conference schedule. Josh, we've got 3 non-conference games for everyone to schedule. So we're going to let you schedule an FCS. So go play the FCS to help them out and give them the payout. Our committee is going to schedule 2 games for you. And the only condition that we have is that we're going to hold tight to the rivalries, the Clemson, South Carolina type games. And the second portion of this is we're going to give you a composite 500 opponents record from those 2 games in conference. Therefore, theoretically, you're going to play an even schedule across the board. I don't want a weighted schedule like the NFL. I don't want to try to create parity. I want to try to create equality. And then the committee is going to make a judgment. So let's say we're building Clemson's schedule and South Carolina went 3-6 the previous season in conference. We're going to give them another opponent that went 6-3 in their conference, so they have a 500 composite record for their 2 opponents out of the Power 5 from the previous season. But the committee is going to be able to make somewhat of a subjective conclusion in regards to we expect this team to be a little bit better, a little bit worse, so we'll try to get them that 6-3 team that's going to balance the schedule. It's not perfect, but at least it gives balance to this scheduling non-conference.
So I think there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. I may push back a little bit on it.
Sure.
So I think the first point, and it's fair, is that divisional opponents don't always balance out at all. And right now, poor South Carolina and Texas A&M, right? Their schedules are just brutal. The fact, and we pointed this out, maybe it's a good point. It's another one of the sort of statistics we drew up in the past few weeks. When you look at where Texas A&M is and where Cincinnati is, I mean, Texas A&M is a victim of how strong their schedule was with teams coming out of the East. And Cincinnati, who's number 17 right now, their only top 50 win is actually number 18 UCF. UCF's only top 50 win is number 46 Temple. So that's a whole deck of cards, but they end up ranked because they have 1 loss to Ohio State. And is Ohio State a great team? Yes. Cincinnati was not competitive in that game, and they followed it up with a 24-14 win over a bad UCLA team. Cincinnati did not have any 14-point or greater win over any top 75 team. So even the teams that they played that were in the 50 to 75 range, they couldn't put any numbers on them. And they won close against number 107 East Carolina, Tulsa, South Florida. Now, if you look at A&M, A&M's unranked basically just because their schedule was so hard. And again, you could be at Cincinnati and get ranked, but A&M, I mean, they beat a top 50 team in South Carolina. South Carolina has a couple top 50 wins in Georgia and Kentucky. Texas A&M blew out number 41 South Carolina. They blew out Mississippi State, who was a top 75 team. Their only close win over a team outside the top 75 was Arkansas. Every other team they've handled. But they had an awful draw from the East. They get Georgia. They get South Carolina, who, South Carolina's record's bad, but they're not a terrible team. And I don't think they're very good, but they're still good. And they're not Vanderbilt, and they're not Kentucky. And they're not Missouri, depending on what week it is, it feels like. But, that's sort of the reality of it. So I get the point that you want to have it balanced, because if you want to have a fair idea of what it means to be ranked, or what it means, especially when we're living in this world where your conference record ends up being where you're ranked, because we're all in these silos, there has to be some parity even within the conference. And you don't have a situation like, if you look back at Indiana's schedule this year, they played basically everybody that's easy in the Big Ten, and they only caught the bottom part of the opposite end of that conference, and their schedule is kind of a complete mess in the same way. Now, here's where I'll push back a little bit. I think you have to be careful, or I would say you need to be careful on relying too much on a 500 record, and balancing out to a 500 record is a degree of difficulty. And this is an interesting stat I dug up yesterday. When you look at ESPN's strength of schedule ranking, and we talk about this with strength of schedule all the time, people will cite it without knowing what it is or understanding that it has to be very particularized and how it operates. So a strength of schedule to go with one loss in a season will be completely different than a strength of schedule to be 500 in a season. Sagarin, they rate strength of schedule based off difficulty to make a bowl game. So if you played 6, 0, and 12 teams, and 6, 12, and 0 teams, and go 6 and 6, they actually consider that an extremely easy schedule, even if you play number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I've always wondered how ESPN's FPI operates, and they don't keep historical records, so I've been trying to track it through the year. Right now, you got 2 games left, so it's very telling if you look at their remaining strength of schedule to see what they consider to be important. And it turns out they're looking at your odds to go 500. And I know that because, for example, Penn State schedule and Buffalo schedule, strength of schedule, are 66th and 67th. Penn State plays number 1 Ohio State and number 118 Rutgers. Buffalo plays number 127 Bowling Green. Because what they're saying is the odds to go 500 with Penn State schedule, pretty darn good, because you can beat Rutgers. And you get another chance against number 1. Maybe that's worth an extra 2%, but you can beat Rutgers. And Bowling Green's going to go 500 because they're going to be, Buffalo's going to go 500 because they're going to beat Bowling Green. And, that's how Alabama ends up 77th in remaining strength of schedule, because they play Auburn and NFCS. It gets really weird, though, at the top. Like Florida State plays number 11 Florida, and they're the number 2 strength of schedule remaining. Texas A&M plays Georgia and LSU, and they're 3rd behind Florida State, because it's easier to go 500 against 2 teams than it is to go 500 against 1 team. And that's why Texas A&M is behind Florida State in difficulty remaining strength of schedule. The point I'm making here is I don't think anybody in their right mind would say Penn State has an easy strength of schedule remaining, because they got to play Ohio State. I think you've got to be careful to look at 500 as your metric, because playing a team that's going to have 1 loss is way easier than playing 2 7-5 teams. And I'd much rather play an 8-4 and an 8-4 than an 11-1 and like a 3-9. Those aren't actually balanced.
Absolutely. Okay. So this is why I've got the committee, because I've got smart guys like you. So that's the framework that I give you. Make it a 500 schedule, but that's where you come in and say, okay, Clemson needs to play South Carolina. They went 3-6 in the SEC last year. Again, we go to a 9-game conference schedule. So I got to go find a 6-3 team. So I'm going to run the metrics and find the right pairing, or the closest pairing that I can. Because if I'm following you, I took the assumption, and I was arguing with a few people recently, and so I took the assumption that I think you just explained, so correct me if I'm wrong, that let's say you're a top 10 to 15 team in the country, or really any team in the country, and you're playing 2 games. You would much rather play, let's say, especially if you're a really good team, you're a top 10 type team, you're Notre Dame. You would much rather play 2 teams ranked, we got 130 teams, 65 and 66th in the country, than play Ohio State and play UTEP. You would much rather play, because you can handle the 65th and 66th ranked teams in the country versus playing the best team in the country and the worst team in the country. But those strength of schedules are the same, correct? Or roughly the same?
They'll often be roughly the same. Well, or actually, because sometimes the number 1 and number 130 is worse. In Sagarin, playing number 1 and number 130 will be ranked significantly lower than playing 65 and 6, because it'll say, if you were number 90 in the country, you'd have a hard time going 1-1 against number 65 and number 66. But if you were number 90 in the country, you could beat UTEP. Your odds of beating UTEP are better than going 1-on-1 otherwise. So your odds of going 500 are actually better. So it'll rank that 1 and 130 schedule worse than the 65 and 66. Strength of schedule, and it's a mathematical problem. What is hard for number 5 to go, 10 and 2 can be completely different than what is hard for number 75 to go 6 and 6. Because there are certain games that are unwinnable to you if you're 80th in the country. So you don't even care about those. You just care about, can I win the bottom, what are my 6 easiest games? That's the only thing that's going to determine your record is your 6 easiest games. If you're a top 10 team, the only thing that determines how difficult your schedule is your top 6 teams. So those metrics are, and mathematically, you create a formula and it has to be directed towards one or the other. There's no way to do a mathematical formula that considers both unless you somehow did it that maybe you ran 2 formulas and weighted them. But it's not going to be relevant to every team in football. So I guess that's sort of the way it shakes out in that regard.
So definitely, if you're on the line right now, we've got 74 on the line, and this is kind of a surprise notification. So we appreciate you jumping on board and being flexible with your schedule with no notification that we were going to talk to Josh here at 2:00 Eastern on a Friday. But we've got him for some college football talk, some smart talk right here that I preach all the time. But we're taking it to another level because Josh is I certainly want the pushback and the challenge on some of my thoughts here, or the backing on some of them as well, regarding what we have to do each and every week as people that are either on the college football playoff selection committee that get the ultimate power, or the rest of us that just like to analyze the sport and try to give some type of evaluation or context to all of this. So as you look at the metrics as they play out through the season for the teams that really matter, that are in conference contention, what we talked about, the sport being somewhat boring leading into the season, that we know who the main players are going to be. Have there been specific, not necessarily games, because we know Illinois beating Wisconsin as a 30-point underdog was a surprise to all of us, but things that have played out that have surprised you, or meaningful metrics that you really point to that have shaped this season?
So I think the thing that surprised me the most has probably been the way, probably Georgia, the way they've played, the way they failed to dominate their opponents. And we subscribe to the same concept that I think Bill Connolly does with his SP Plus, which is that dominating bad teams is a sign of being a good team. That's happened several times. Everybody remembers Clemson last year, but Ohio State in 2014 had a very weak schedule, dominated it, and it showed up that really does matter. And that's been pretty consistent. I find it interesting how so many teams this year have been sort of doing their business with a really weak schedule and dominating it. And then we have other teams that are playing much more difficult schedules and they can't seem to win with any real margin. I mean, LSU has a great record in terms of wins. They have a really poor record in terms of blowout wins. It's a 1-score win over Auburn, a 1-score win over Alabama. It's a 1-score win over Texas. It's a 1-score win over Florida. And I think LSU is a really, really good team. And we have them ranked very high. My top 10, I have them number 2. But I have them number 2 because at least, Ohio State is dominating everybody week in and week out. And I'd rather see that, frankly, than see a team that struggles to put teams away. Georgia has the same problem. Only their schedule is a lot weaker, and they're still winning by a touchdown every week. Georgia fans kind of hate us right now because we're critical of it. I think the most interesting thing is trying to take those two concepts, that is resume in terms of win-loss more important, or is quality of play, regardless of, or maybe, and like with us or SP Plus, very much accounting for the strength of your opponent, but is dominating someone to an extreme degree that's merely okay, better than barely winning it against a team that's very good. And it's hard to do. And I'll sort of flesh that out or nitpick 2 points with it too. You've got to be careful when you do that, when records fall below a certain point. There's a lot of evidence that advanced metrics tend to inflate teams that play a weak schedule, because you can play certain types of offenses. Those high-powered spread offenses will put up 70 points on bad teams consistently, and they'll fall flat when they play a really, really good team. And a metric we've talked about a lot was Michigan going into this year. I think it was 32 points per game. Daniel always has the stat, against top 50 offenses, average. I mean, they would be number 2 in the country in SP Plus in defense, and they would consistently, when they played an upper tier, top 30 offense, they were always giving up 30 plus points every single time. And what that showed is certain offensive styles and certain teams, the dominance they had didn't translate. And then other teams, the dominance they had would translate. And it's very difficult. And I think you have to really examine the best teams on a schedule. You have to be careful looking into metrics. You have to understand what the metrics are. And I do think things like SP Plus are very helpful in that regard. But I think you have to kind of stop and say, have they played someone good enough to at least test them, that the number is meaningful? And then if the answer is yes, then you can move forward. And if the answer is no, then you have to take a step back. And I think that's more telling for the Minnesotas, who I think Minnesota had a good game against Penn State. But, for example, Penn State had been tested against good opposing defenses, has not been tested against good opposing offenses. The one game they had against Minnesota did not look good. And there were signs there that maybe Penn State's defense, which was extremely highly rated in advanced metrics, may not really be on that level. But that's kind of the as the cookie crumbles sort of concept there, I think.
As we saw, Peyton Ramsey hit them for 371 yards the next week when they played Indiana, the Penn State defense. Definitely. So as you look at, first of all, I would like you to explain your metrics without giving away the secret sauce, but explain your metrics, what people are going to find when they check out College Football Nerds in regards to your breakdown of the major matchups, and what metrics you guys have built and given weight to that you find valuable in determining a final score. And with being brutally honest, how close that formula's been and how accurate to final score result.
So our approach, we do models for big games, and some of it has to be done by hand currently. We may automate it, but that's a step we haven't gotten to yet. And that's more to do with data sources than anything else. We look at how a team does in a per play sense. First off, I think you have to account for tempo in any statistical model, and all the good ones do. Anybody that cites total yardage to me or to us, we generally throw out immediately, because if you're citing total yardage right now, I don't want to be mean and say you don't fully understand where the game's at, but there's some truth to it. I mean, the teams are playing 60 plays a game versus 90 plays a game. It's not the same conference to conference. You need to look at how you're doing per play, so it's at least on a level playing field. And we build kind of an internal model on how your performance is going to look against an opponent, entirely relationally. So we'll look at how you did against the opponent you played, how they did against everybody else. An internal statistic that we generate as part of our model that I don't know why it's not out there in general, is a percentage of opponent averages allowed. So if your opponents are averaging 6 yards per carry and you allow 3, you're allowing 50% of their averages. That seems like a pretty neutral, plain statistic that's adjusted for opponent quality. It doesn't exist, and it's a simple one to calculate. I don't know why it doesn't exist as a simple number, but it doesn't. And then based on that, the sort of idea that's behind our model is every team responds to yardage and opportunity in a different way, and different offenses respond differently. Pro style offenses will tend to score. A really good pro style offense can score 20 to 35 points, almost irrespective of the quality of the defense. They kind of get theirs consistently, but they don't scale up against bad defenses the same way. They struggle to score 50 points in a game, even when an opposing team isn't so good, because there's a lot of more low percentage throws and more difficult concepts that have to be executed. Whereas a spread team, we frequently see will score 50 points a game until they play a top 20 defense, and then they'll score 10. So it builds a scoring model unique to your team, and it looks at your past history and what caused certain things to happen in terms of scoring and output to gauge for you a unique scoring model. It's kind of a machine learning concept that we're applying, or I guess theoretically really is machine learning, though I don't usually call it that. And then based on that, in that particular matchup, with the matchups that are involved and the relative strengths and weaknesses, it spits out a scoring result. And I'll say it's been pretty consistently accurate really the past few years. I think last year it started something like 15-0 against the spread, which that's unsustainable. But it has been successful.
By definition, almost, unless you can sustain perfection. Yes.
Yeah, it has been more successful than not. I mean, we do beat the spread generally. I mean, LSU Alabama had 44-38 Alabama. It's kind of funny with games like that people say, well, you're way off. You picked the wrong winner. But what it's telling you is it was a one-score game scoring around 40 points. All that was generally correct. There's certain things that are variable in college football. Whether you're positive or negative in the turnover margin is absolutely not a predictable concept. And if you try to say it is or claim it is in a comment somewhere on a YouTube page, you're guessing. And LSU won that game. You can say they won straight up, but they definitely won the way they did because they led in turnover margin over Alabama. And I will say that that's usually kind of our result, and we're usually positive. Let me pull up. You can hear me clicking here, but I'll pull up last week's model. Since you're asking, Auburn, Georgia was 20-20 in our model. It had them as a pretty dead even game. Obviously, that was one missed pass at the end of the game from being able to get a conversion and tie the game 21-all. I feel like that's pretty accurate. It had Oklahoma 40-27 over Baylor. Not that far off. The places where it's generally been wrong are the same places where SP Plus and everyone else is wrong. It had Minnesota 39-25 over Penn State. Had Minnesota 39-14 over Iowa. A lot of our show was talking about where our model is wrong. It's designed to say, based off past results, this is the average B+ game between the two teams. And people will see our model and they'll just scroll to it and go, oh, look, you got this wrong. And they won't even watch our show. And if you watched our show, you'd know we didn't pick Minnesota to win 39-14 over Iowa. We didn't pick Minnesota to win 39-25 over Penn State. What we talked about on the show was, okay, Minnesota's schedule was so weak that they were able to dominate it to a large extent, especially the past 5 weeks. And they dominated 5 backup quarterbacks in a row. And that was throwing up all the advanced metrics because none of these models really account for injuries, nor is there any good way to do that. And so you have to do the numbers and then interpret them. And what we're just trying to do is to say, here's a reasonable way to get a baseline of what the B+ game is relative to these two teams. And now that we have that, do we think that's right? Do we think it's wrong? How do we adjust from there? But things like Auburn, Georgia, 2020, what that tells you is the actual results of the actual production Auburn had against their opponents and the actual production and scoring Georgia had against theirs was equal. I mean, Georgia may have better yardage in a lot of ways, but they didn't score relative to that yardage. They have not been able to capitalize over a positive yardage differential all year, while Auburn manages to score points in that Gus Malzahn offense on these big bust plays frequently. And so it was saying, yeah, you should really expect this to be a very close or a tight game. Even though it did expect Georgia to outperform Auburn in our model, it generates yardage statistics. It knew the score was going to be quite close.
So, Josh, I'm guessing that when the model is off, it's during a game in which everybody was off, meaning anybody's model. This game was a complete surprise. Vegas was off. Everybody was off. We just didn't see it coming, number one. Illinois is a 31-point underdog beating Wisconsin when just nobody was going to guess that was happening. I would guess, number two, that the more competitive the game, the closer the model is to the final score and what should happen, versus if you take that model and put it against an Ohio State Rutgers kind of game where the play becomes meaningless in the second half and doesn't matter so much. You don't know who's going to be on the field. You don't know what the motivation is. You don't know what coaching approach is going to be taken, whether we're going to slam on the throttle and we're going to crush them by 70, or we want to get on the bus and get out of here and we don't care if we win by 20. That the less the competitive game, I would think, the less the model can be accurate. Would be my guess.
I think you might be a little surprised. So the way our model works, it's actually pretty accurate at predicting a lot of the blowouts if you have teams that are uneven. It's pretty good at flagging that, and the reason being, we don't use a linear points per yard system. It's based off the concept that when you cross 6, a lot of times teams will have a margin like 6 yards per play or 8 yards per play where the offense just goes off, where they score on every drive, or there'll be a certain point where teams start shutting down. And we do an exponential curve. It's a variant normal curve sort of base thing, polynomial stuff. That helps you predict blowouts better, because we'll look at it and say, okay, if you're Ohio State and you play a team below a certain threshold defensively, you're going to put up 50 points. And it kind of knows where Ohio State tends to stop in scoring. And so it'll predict those. The hardest ones to predict are really your competitive games where the prediction's between 15 and 25 points. And the reason for that being that your whole game usually hinges on a couple plays, 1 or 2 turnovers, a special teams play, the Auburn, Georgia example of a drop pass. We had Florida narrowly beating Auburn, Auburn narrowly beating Florida early in the year. And, my takeaway at the end of that, when we did the whole prediction, was, okay, the model was predicting it to be, right under 20, south of 20 points, slightly, I think, favoring Auburn. I don't remember offhand, but I made the point, look, at this point, the model is saying it's going to be a really tight game below 25 points, which means teams start reacting differently in that situation. They try to generate points on a trick play or something. And Auburn has been the master of the trick play score for years under Gus Malzahn. They have a lot of things wrong with them, but that's the one thing they're really good at, is getting cheap points as a function of the offense. So I said they're going to get one cheap score in the fourth quarter, and that's going to be enough to have them win a game. And I think I had it like 24-20. What ended up happening was that Florida had a long run by Perine in the fourth quarter that was like an 86-yard run, and they took like 3 or 4 point game and ended up winning by 2 scores. But that whole game came down to one play. If Auburn has the long run and not Florida, Auburn wins that game. And I think that's the hardest thing for people to accept or understand. But when you have games at that particular margin, it always comes down to one play. And quite frankly, that is a very random statistic and a really random variable. No one can accurately predict it. I will say our model is probably about 85% of the time we're within a field goal of the Vegas spread. So it's useful to a certain extent, but it's also not completely useful because it's telling you the Vegas spread. And there've been, I think, several games this year where we've actually hit the Vegas spread and the over under if you do that, the combined calculation between the two. But it's definitely true that the most variable games are the games where they're low scoring and highly competitive games, because those are the games where people start throwing out trick plays and they start breaking tendencies, and you start getting weird results or 2-score wins because somebody has to do something desperate, and it either works and they score and they win a game they shouldn't, or it doesn't work and then they lose by 2 or 3 scores because it goes the other way.
Got Josh on the line from College Football Nerds. I encourage you to jump over there and check out their breakdowns of all the key matchups in college football each and every week, and the metrics they apply, and then the context given to give a projection on the score result. So are there any of the baseline statistics that still make sense when you look at, you mentioned the yards per play and how relevant that is, but when we look at the traditional box score, where would your eyes go to first for those people that don't want to do the deep dive into the advanced metrics?
So in the box score, the thing you should always be looking at is yards per play concepts for both teams. Yards per attempt, yards per carry. And I think the thing that I would point people towards, one, you always have to keep in mind in college that sacks count against rushing totals. And you've got to throw that out to a large extent when you're evaluating teams because it sort of screws everything up.
And why they don't change that, I don't know.
They've done it forever.
Yes,
I think
it drives me crazy.
I think they're maybe concerned about it, meaning that your record books for best, rushing offense historically is not going to line up to what it would be now. Everybody would set records rushing, and nobody could ever set a record passing because all the statistics would be screwed up relative to past teams. But I do think it's inaccurate or at least deceptive. I usually look at like the top 2 backs on a team. What are their yard per carry totals? I look at the quarterback's yard per attempt total. I care more about the yard per attempt total than I do completion percentage or QB rating, frankly. Because if you have a really high yard per attempt total and you're throwing 50% of your passes, it just means you're throwing deep a lot. Or you can have a very high completion percentage and a low yard per attempt total, which Jake Fromm has had several times this season because you're throwing checkdowns over and over again. And that's not really a good sign either. Another thing that we'll often do is if you want to not like an insider useful tidbit, is look at the long column. And, ESPN has a column that will tell you what's the longest play from a given player, longest rush, longest pass. Consider what it looks like if that play is redacted. And it's important to have those long plays, and it's not ignoring it from a given team. But when you're talking about predictability, how good a team is, meaning how they're going to do in another game, not why they won this one, but how are they going to do in the next one, those long plays are pretty random. You can't count on them. And if there's like one long play, if there's like the Perine run against Auburn, that's not a reflection of how good Florida was offensively. That was a reflection of one big play against Auburn, and the rest of the rush stats were kind of garbage. And I don't know how many times I've seen these games and it was Auburn. We were very critical of Auburn early in the season because we'd point out they'd be in a game. It's like, yeah, these are their pass stats, but like against A&M, they have a jet sweep to Schwartz that goes for 80 yards. And if you take that out, they're 3.5 yards per attempt. And sure, they look like they were an okay 7, but all that yardage came on a really non-passing busted play, they can't move the ball, move the sticks, get first downs. That's going to catch up to them when they play a real team, and it has. That's probably the biggest sort of insight is you look at those per play stats and then, look at the long and see how much of this too is based off one random, busted play by the opposing defense, one random missed assignment somewhere, or, one big chunk play. Because in football, if you can't have consistency at all, you're not going to score. You've got to be able to get first downs. You've got to be able to get conversions to, move the chains. And yardage, football is a weird sport that explosive yardage generates points far more efficiently than anything else. So it's very good if you can do that consistently. But explosive plays are very unpredictable and a lot of it very inconsistent. Consistent yardage makes you a good team week to week. That's why those grinded out, defensively laden teams that are good at moving the sticks are the teams you always see in the championship. And those super high scoring explosive offenses like Oklahoma tend to fall short because you can make lots of big plays and you can average 65 points a game, but Oklahoma can't average 65 points a game and do it every quarter. We've seen that all year. They'll put up a ton of points, and their per quarter scoring is leading the country. I have no doubt, but they've got a lot of quarters where they don't score any points. And if they string two of those together in a single game with their defense, they lose.
College football fans seem to love the transitive property if it backs up their argument and hate it when it doesn't. You got to obviously be very careful with it because aside from any team that's undefeated, we can make the connections to pretty much prove that any team over here by 7 connections is better than this team over here. But once we get to this point in the season, Josh, within these teams playing within their own divisions, like a USC UCLA game this week, pick your game across the nation, they've collectively played probably 5 common opponents. Can we gather anything from the results of those games? Not necessarily the statistics, but just looking at the score differentials of, let's say, 2 teams playing in week 13 or 14 that played 5 or 6 common division opponents, and then maybe played another 1 or 2 common on the other side where they play, let's say, 7 like opponents by that point in the season.
I do think there's things you could take away. Again, the per play stats are always useful. You can go to certain sites, and I'll throw out a site name. I don't think there's a problem with it, but like cfbstats.com is awesome, where you can cite versus conference. I mean, you can actually sort the stuff and look at FBS only, conference only. We always throw out everything you see from our channel. Usually we ignore FCS statistics. There's a lot of reasons for it. Not only are FCS teams bad, but you don't know who the FCS teams played themselves. So there's, the fact that you did well against them may or may not mean anything. So we just toss them. But you can sort and look at conference only statistics and look at what, your passing, yard per play is relative only to your conference play. And you can use that especially to sort in within conference play to figure out how good it is. Or you could sort against teams with a winning record, teams that are ranked at the time. And it's really easy to sort of click through if you're doing that. And you get a pretty quick idea of where a team is. And hey, if a lot of teams like Penn State and their rushing attack, they feasted on bad teams. And if you look at their rush numbers on average, they're good. If you look at their rush numbers against teams that were actually, had a winning record, they're not good. And that's kind of a good little thing you can do actually fairly quickly with a site like CFB Stats.
Then my other question would go to the opposite end of the spectrum. Take your model early season. How does that model work? Does it take last season's statistics and try to run it through some type of personnel additions and subtractions and try to come up with some kind of reasonable numbers?
So ours does not. So we don't actually run our model until week 4, week 5. And the reason being that we don't like to do that. Anyone that has a model based in the preseason or on week 1, week 3 has to inject last season's results or some sort of past stuff into the model. You got to do recruiting rankings. You got to do injuries or returning production is a very common one. But the problem with all that is every time you introduce a factor that isn't directly causally linked to the performance on the field, you have to assign it some weight, some value in the model. You have to say returning production is worth 0.25 and past year's record is worth 0.5, et cetera, et cetera. The model is a computer model, but it's actually a reflection of your own weights that you've injected into the metrics. And now it's weighted by results, so it's not It is somewhat objective, but it must necessarily be somewhat subjective because you have to have your own variables. I think the thing that makes our model interesting and unique is I do not code any variable weights in my model at all. It's the machine learning aspect. That's kind of where it comes in. I use past results within the season to create the variable weights for your team. And we do that so that we run the model. It's a true objective, neutral look at your team. We have no hand in it. It's not really my opinion on what's important. This was the computer's opinion, what was important based off what mattered to you. If you do anything different, and we've looked at it, if we put in, like, if we averaged our model with last year's scores, it does make it something like 2% more accurate, a few percent more accurate to do that. The problem with that, I will say, is, and this is a big danger of a lot of advanced metrics. I'm not going to point it out about anybody, but I've seen certain people argue for certain things in their metrics, and I think this is a flaw. Just because something makes it your model more accurate on the whole, I think doesn't necessarily mean it's more useful or insightful. Because if all I know is your team is going to be a lot like what they were last year, yeah, that might be on the, on the whole more true, but that does a really bad job of flagging when a particular team is not doing well compared to when they were last year. And our model last year did a very good job, and I think our show did a very good job of early in the season picking up on the fact that Ohio State had a lot of defensive issues that were going to flag itself. And we were on top of that right after the TCU game. In fact, we did a TCU preview, and we were on top of that issue in the TCU preview, and then we did our model. It showed up. If we had averaged last year, the prior year's results, we would have never seen that. I mean, you would never see that issue showing up because college football is a very constantly ever evolving sport. And the best teams and the worst teams and the most disappointing teams, essentially the most interesting ones, are always teams that don't follow what the projections say they should, good or bad.
Got Josh on the line from College Football Nerds. Josh, I could bring up 82 other topics, but we'll leave everyone with this one. So I'm sure you've got your thoughts about what the college football playoff should look like. I certainly do, and go on a rampage from time to time about that. But we'll set that aside because all the conferences can't be represented. And in my view, that's the start of the issue. But let's take the current model. It would be amazing if you actually, Josh, could come up with a model that would accurately predict what the college football playoff selection committee is going to select. But as it stands right now, how would you approach within this system evaluating these teams and making those selections? What would your criteria be?
I think that's interesting. Let me address something you said, and then I'll move on to the question. And it's something I saw in the comments a couple of times. I said it's machine learning-esque, and I don't call it machine learning in our model. And the reason for that being, I don't know that you can really accurately train anything or any model to deal with things like the playoff or playoff selection. I am, in our show, stat-based as our channel is, we're really critical of some statistical things, and not to call out 538, but they have their playoff predictor model, and I think it had Notre Dame, it's like a 40% chance to make the playoff last year at the end of the season, knowing that they were undefeated, if you said they're going to go undefeated, which was absurd. And the reason for that being that if you're talking about picking teams for the playoff, you can't model that because you're talking about what people think should happen, not what should happen from an objective metric. And you have the siloing problem where you can't properly evaluate a Pac-12 team to a Big Ten team because they have not played out of conference games. You don't know what that would look like. That's never going to be fixable. And anybody that tries to fix it, and I think this was a major flaw of the BCS, particularly because they didn't allow margin of victory to be involved. And this does answer your question, right? You can't do it on a model or a formula. You can use that as an interesting or effective way to say this team has played well, but you have to use the eye test unless we have a much more robust way to do non-conference scheduling. Until then, you're not going to get anything really useful out of it. And so my personal viewpoint on the playoff and how maybe it should be structured or how the selection should work, I like taking the best teams available. I don't like auto bids. I think auto bids create problems. Most of the time, auto bids would work, but most of the time we've gotten conference champions for a reason. The problem with auto bids is the same problem of what you're trying to avoid when you don't have them. It's the question of what would, hating the fact that Alabama got in 2017, right? And you sort of ignore that when you call that a problem because you say, okay, it only matters in the edge case where you have a strong argument where you've got a 2-loss Big Ten team, and all the other champs are 2 losses, right? And they lost in a blowout to an unranked team, and then Alabama's only loss was to a top 10 team, so they didn't win their division. That's the exception. Ohio State had the same thing happen within their own conference with Penn State just a year prior, and we were also, we were in favor of both of those getting in, 2016 Ohio State and 2017 Alabama, because you happen geographically to be in the same region with somebody else who we think is a top 4 team does not mean you're not a top 4 team. I also don't like auto bids because you get teams like Washington. If you expand to 8 and you take all 5 conference champions and then at larges, Washington a couple of years ago was a 3-loss team that won the Pac-12 and lost to Auburn in their opener. I don't want Washington in the playoff. I'm sorry. They don't deserve to be in over other teams that were in the playoff that year. And even it's funny that even like the UCF example, there were a couple of years ago, well, you take the top non-P5 team. What's funny is if you do the branch out all the P5 champs and then the top non-P5 champ, and then the 2 at larges, that slot actually goes to Notre Dame. Unless you exclude Notre Dame from that metric, it doesn't go to UCF, so they still don't get in. But nobody actually thinks that through. Unless you want to say Notre Dame has to be the not top G5 team or non-P5 team, but they get in at large, but no, that's actually going to how it works out. My opinion on when you move to 8 is that you never end up encompassing good teams at 7 and 8. I'm kind of in favor of taking 6, and I'm trying to look up a particular stat here. I'm in favor of looking at 6 because I think there have been instances where 5 and 6 were sort of deserving. More importantly, I think it's too difficult for a G5 team to get in the top 4 because of the way it works out every year. The G5 teams are just almost never going to manage to be a top 4 team. And if you look back the past 20 years, there have been some really good G5 teams that have made the top 8. UCF in their last year with Melton did make number 8 right at the playoff. That was close, but they also didn't play well within their conference. Not only do they have a weak record, but they also had several 1-score wins over bad teams. I didn't think they quite deserved to be in that year. Boise would have been when they were really, really good, and they were genuinely a good team with a lot of NFL talent, as it turned out. Doug Martin, probably the most underrated player on any team in recent memory on those Boise State teams. They would get in a top 6 scenario. So I like top 6. I'm going to rag on someone real quick. I don't like when people want to just do the pure conference champ thing because 1, it's never internally consistent. 2, I think it creates the Washington problem. Joel Klatt was arguing that we should keep the CF college football playoff at 4 and we should only take conference champions. And he said we shouldn't do auto bids where you just take every conference champion and you have 6 or 8 where you take all the conference champions because there's undeserving ones like Washington. He just thought you could be a G5 or a P5 and be a champion, and from that pool you make a selection. What I thought was funny about that is he, in the same tweet, he said he starts auto bids are not great because they devalue the most important and unique regular season, which is meaning you win your conference and nothing else matters. And then the next sentence is I suggest keeping college football playoff at 4 and only taking teams if they won their conference. The combination of those 2 sentences in the same tweet is let's not do auto bids because they're bad, but let's only pick from teams that would be auto bids. That's what he said. And you always have that inconsistency. Every time somebody argues for the auto bid concept, when you actually go push to shove and you talk about, okay, in the scenario where I wouldn't already be taking the auto bid, in a scenario where I wouldn't already be taking the Big Ten champion or the Pac-12 champion, which is the 2016 example with Penn State, do you really think I should take Penn State instead of Ohio State because Penn State won in the pouring rain and there was their only win over Ohio State, and then Penn State got drilled by Michigan and lost to Pitt? And usually the answer is, well, not really, but they'd be in at large. It's like, okay, so the one scenario where it actually mattered, you don't think they should be in. It's just you like it because most of the time they should be in, but it's not a real problem. It's only a problem, I think, mostly because people, they want their conference in the playoff and they're mad they're not in. That's I think, the long and short of it.
Well, I do think that there is a reason that we have conferences. So you will somewhat agree with this, but you will not agree with the base of it. And I do think that every conference should be represented, but not in a 4-team playoff. Because I don't necessarily believe in selecting the 4 best teams, because who are the 4 best teams? Your 4 best teams might be different than my 4 best teams that are different from somebody else's 4 best teams. For example, if we go back to 2011, all sorts of people asked me at the end of the regular season when the BCS spit out Alabama and LSU, should Alabama and LSU be playing in the national championship game? And I said no. And then they would routinely then ask, you don't think that they're the two best teams in the country? And I would say, absolutely, I do. I would bet my mortgage on Alabama and LSU proving themselves to be the two best teams in a 16, 32 team tournament, whatever the case might be. But I don't believe that they earned it based on the format in which we've structured college football. 2015, Ohio State, they lost to Michigan State head-to-head. They didn't have a chance to win the Big Ten. Were they one of the four best teams? I would argue they were the best team in the country. They had an NFL team, but they didn't get a chance to go into the playoffs. So if you're going to give me all the power and say select the four best teams, I'll do that. And I'll just randomly, not randomly, obviously there's substance behind it, but select Ohio State in a 2015 scenario and say, I don't care that Michigan State beat them in the rain on a last-second field goal, because Michigan State lost to 5-7 Nebraska, and Ohio State's an NFL team, and they would clock Michigan State 9 out of 10 times. They should be in the playoff if we want a good playoff and see Ohio State play Alabama and Clemson. But we're going to put Michigan State in there because they deserve it or they earned it. I go the earning route, even though it doesn't always produce the best football. And like you, in 2016, Ohio State, better than Penn State. Better resume, better talent, but they lost on the field. They lost the Big Ten championship. So I was actually rooting and ranting and railing against the committee in selecting Ohio State over Penn State, as I was in 2017, when, again, I picked Alabama to win its 2 playoff games in 2017, but I said they did not earn a playoff spot. So it's just 2 different ways to look at it, whether you're saying we need to have teams earn their spot or we need to select the 4 best teams, or come up with a way in which we can reasonably defend those being the 4 best teams.
The only thing I would say with that is when you talk about earning it, it's earning it in terms of pure wins, losses versus earning it in terms of overall performance.
Sure.
A lot of this it depends on your definition of earn. In like with 2016 Penn State, I don't think Penn State earned that slot, not because of Ohio State was a better team, quote, and start quote, end quote, but because Penn State did have a blowout loss, and they did have that loss to an unranked team in Pitt. And to me, that meant they didn't earn it. So I don't view winning the conference as de facto earning it. I don't view right now, I'm having a hard time buying that if Oregon wins the Pac-12, that they've earned the slot. Now, I will buy the argument, and most of the time when someone's gotten in, be it Alabama in 2017 or and this would be my argument with Penn State in 2016. The problem has not been that 2017 Alabama earned the slot or 2016 Ohio State did. The problem has been that Penn State in 2016 lost the spot. They failed to earn it by losing that game to Penn. In 2017, Ohio State failed to earn the spot by losing those 2 games that they did and having their blowout loss. So I think the problem when you talk about earning it is it goes both ways. And if you're a conference champ and you go undefeated, you obviously earn it. The problem is who earned it more? A team that has 2 losses but won their conference, or a team that has 1 loss in another conference but played a tougher schedule? I don't think it's so clear on what the word earn means. And I know that seems sort of disingenuous, but like 2015 Ohio State, I mean, they had a very weak schedule. They opened with a bad Virginia Tech team. They didn't play ranked teams through the year. They had some narrow wins over teams like Northern Illinois, like Indiana. So part of their problem really was Michigan State was a be-all, end-all game for them in 2015. And the other problem for Ohio State in 2015 was not related to Ohio State themselves. It was the landscape of college football. That when you were comparing them to a Michigan State team in 2015, it was really hard to argue that they should be in over a Michigan State team that also had 1 loss but had actually beaten them. So they had the same number of losses and a head-to-head, and they were a conference champion. And then all the other teams you'd compare Ohio State to also had the same number of losses, were conference champions, and had more difficult schedules. So it's always relative to everybody else. And when you say somebody earned it, you never earn it in a vacuum. You always earn it relative to your competition. I do think that's how the playoff committee works today. I do think that's how the playoff committee could operate in a 6-team playoff or an 8-team. I just think that if you use that criteria with 6 teams, you'd always capture anyone that had reasonably argued that they had earned their way in. And I think when you get to 8, when you get the prospect of bringing in 3 lost teams more often than not, Wisconsin, I think it was 2016, Wisconsin is a top 8 team going into the playoff with 3 losses. I don't think a 3-loss team has ever earned the right to be in a playoff and they get an at-large or what have you, and that's why I don't like the 8 team.
I guess I would completely buy your angle, which I get your angle. Your angle is more in terms of overall performance subjective than mine is. Mine is rewarding the conference structure. So I would totally buy it if we blew up the conferences and we just ranked the teams and just listed them 1 through 130. So if you went to your standings on any website, it would just go 1 to 130, and there wouldn't be any conferences, number one. And number two, there would be more cross play between all the teams in the various conferences. I just don't think we have enough data. And this goes way back to our first subject point. We don't have enough data points between all these teams to evaluate them accurately.
Right. And this is a basic question of fairness. Given the lack of cross-conference data, what do you want to emphasize or reward? You emphasize the fact that we've got to have the conferences play each other at the end to know how the best teams compare and to have the definitive data point? Or is your focus, which ours is more on, okay, if you want to earn that slot, then play somebody out of conference. You're as a whole, the conference needs to play people out of conference, get some wins, show you're good, and then you need to dominate within it. And we'd rather, our view is more rewarding you for what you've done and what you've done relative to teams that have also won big games. And then that's our benchmark. But I totally get the argument that you don't know. And that gets back to our original point, right? The Big 12 has 0 out of conference wins over a top 50 team. And maybe Oklahoma, and I might buy the argument that Oklahoma, if they played Georgia, I think I'd pick Oklahoma. I mean, Georgia's number 4. Oklahoma's way down there in the bottom of the top 10. I think Oklahoma's a fundamentally flawed team. But they've got the same problem as Georgia. They're winning by 7 points against teams they should be blowing out. Now they're doing it 40 to 33 or 45 to 38 rather than 20 to 14, but it looks a lot alike. Now I think Oklahoma would win because they would score a ton of points, and I don't see any reason why Georgia can actually keep up with a high-powered offense. They stop themselves way too much. But by that same vein, that's pure eye test. And, I can at least say definitively, the SEC's won some out of conference games. Auburn beat Oregon. I know they're a pretty good team. I know they're flawed, but they're pretty good. Beating Oregon is not a complete fluke because we saw it. The Big 12 has nothing to show to prove it other than, I assume, beating the teams that are also in the Big 12 are a big deal. But, I can also point to the fact that Kansas State barely beat Mississippi State, and a Mississippi State team that is not competitive within the SEC. So it cuts both ways.
Yeah, I can subjectively sit on my couch, and I think it's logical to say that the SEC is better than the Pac-12, but I don't have a whole lot to go on. But I go on recruiting rankings. I go on what I see. We go to the results that we saw, as you outlined, 6 quality wins against the likes of Texas and Miami and Oregon on down the line. And then also we're going to see it on NFL draft day. And I know that those things don't hit the field when we talk recruiting on the front end of people's collegiate careers and then on the back end. But the SEC has proven for decades to be the best when it comes to signing the talent and then developing the talent to go into the NFL. And the only 2 data points we see between the Pac-12 and the SEC at the top of my head is a Cal Ole Miss game that's fairly meaningless with 2 teams that are in the 8 to 10 range in their conferences, if that, playing a game that went down to a judgment call by the officials at the goal line of where the ball broke the plane. So basically those 2 teams showed on that given day that they were equal regardless of who won the game. And then, as you mentioned, a game in which Oregon had game control for 45 or 50 minutes, blew it late, a 21-6 lead, and Auburn made a play in the last 9 seconds to win the game. An Auburn team that's probably the 4th best team in the SEC versus arguably the best team in the Pac-12.
Yeah, well, I mean, not even 4, right? I mean, Alabama, I would say Alabama, LSU, Georgia, and Florida. They're all, if Alabama wins that game, we'll all have beaten Auburn. So Auburn has really no argument to be anything better than 5th. And Oregon might win the Pac-12 and end up in the playoff. It's a little tough for me to swallow from the pure champion argument side of things.
No, I totally get it. Thank you. The super chat contributions from Bill Clinton. I assume not the Bill Clinton, but and also Uncle Lou. Thank you so much for the super chat contributions. And thanks most of all to Josh from College Football Nerds. We encourage you to jump over there on YouTube, College Football Nerds. You can find it very easily. And Josh, I will get you the last say if there's any other platforms you would like to point people to.
So, yeah, I appreciate it, Ian. Again, we're College Football Nerds. We're on YouTube and iTunes. I swear forgive the production value. There's a reason that Daniel's the one on set and not me, which is that I don't really have a good space to do this. But I from what I had to work with, I had to throw something together. Well, maybe I'll be on camera. We'll build something out.
It at least matches mine, Josh. So don't make me look bad next time.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that. You've at least got some memorabilia and stuff. I just bought a house, so I kind of am at the stage where maybe I can do this soon. But I appreciate you having us on. Hope people tune in. You know, we've followed your stuff for a long time. You put out probably as much or more content than anybody else out there. So it's always interesting to see. And I think. And, I do think this platform's been really good. There's a lot more deep analysis being done. I think it's a shame in recent years there's been sort of a glut of people that do deep dives into different topics and teams in college football. And it's always interesting to hear different opinions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Josh. Everybody else online, thank you so much for grabbing the notification and joining us live. All right, Josh, enjoy the games this weekend.
You too, Mark.